Alright, so in this video we're going to go through the 1980s, and then I'm going to do subsequent videos for the 1990s and the 2000s. So let's get into it here. So leading up to the 80s, and basically since the 30s, the government, especially the House of Representatives and the Senate and even the presidency, was pretty much dominated by the Democrats and the liberals. So we've talked about what the difference between liberals and conservatives are. And going into the 30s and the 40s during the war, 30s was the Great Depression, and then the Cold War following World War II in the 40s, people liked the idea of the government being in charge and the government running things. So that's why you had a lot of government influence. Well, people elected a lot of people to Congress, that's the House of Representatives, and the Senate, and they elected 8 out of 12 presidents were Democrats as well. Eisenhower and Nixon were the only two Republicans, and both of them had Democratic Congresses that prevented them from doing anything conservative. What that means is that a Republican was president, but the Democrats had a majority in the House of Representatives and the Senate. There are 435 people in the House of Reps. There are 100 senators, 2 per state. In 1964, Barry Goldwater was actually one of the first people to launch a conservative agenda. He was running against Lyndon B. Johnson in that election, and he had actually said a few things that were against JFK, who Lyndon B. was his vice president and took over after JFK was assassinated, and many people didn't take kindly to Goldwater attacking JFK the way that he did. So Goldwater would lose, and we would have more Democrats up until Nixon in the 70s, and then after Nixon we had Carter as a Democrat as well in 76. So what happens is these things on the right there, you got Roe v. Wade, the ERA, that's the Equal Rights Amendment, and then Swan v. Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education. So Roe v. Wade legalized abortion. There's going to be a follow-up to that is actually going to give states the right to restrict abortion, but Roe v. Wade legalizes it, and that's a liberal ruling. The ERA was a proposed amendment that did not pass. It basically stated that civil rights may not be denied on the basis of one sex. Obviously, that sounds great on paper, but the right did not like everything else that would come along with that. Drafting in the military, when you turn 18, you have to sign up for selective service if you are a male. If their ERA passed, that means women would get drafted into the military. And to people on the right, they believe that there's a difference between being drafted in the military and then signing up for the military. Women who were divorced wouldn't be able to get child support checks from their ex-husbands. Men would have just as many rights in court as the women when it came to custody of their children. There would be gender-neutral bathrooms. Stay-at-home moms would, be null and void. There wouldn't be any of that. So there were lots of things that the right did not want in the ERA, and the ERA actually never ended up passing. And then finally we have Swan v. Charlotte-Mecklenburg Board of Education. So the school districts in North Carolina are a little bit different than they are here. They have something called county schools. So each county is kind of like the same school district. And there are different high schools within that same school district. The best example I can give for you is Westerville. So Westerville has Westerville North, Westerville Central, and Westerville South. So let's say that one of those schools was predominantly like 99 to 100% African American. What they would do is they being the government would force students. So let's say Westerville Central was predominantly African American. They would take white students from Westerville South and Westerville North and bus them to Westerville Central. They would then take African American students from Westerville Central and bus them to Westerville North and Westerville South. And what that does is that desegregates the schools. So it's purposeful desegregation, meaning you are integrating. Think of the movie Remember the Titans, when you had white and black kids going to school. There were lots of reasons why this wasn't happening. One of the reasons why it happened is there was this thing called white flight. You had white people leaving the inner cities and moving to the suburbs, leaving many African Americans in the inner cities, causing inner city schools to have a higher population of African Americans. So what that leads to is that leads to groups forming on the right. You got the New Right, the Conservative Coalition, and the Moral Majority. The New Right were right-wing groups created in the 1970s to promote specific issues. Some of the issues that they opposed was abortion, the ERA, the court-ordered busing that we talked about with Swan v. Charlotte Mecklenburg. They wanted prayer to return to school. There was another Supreme Court case, I think that was Engel v. Vitale, that banned prayer in school. And they also criticized affirmative action, which we'll go over on the next slide. Then you had the Conservative Coalition. The Conservative Coalition was very similar to the New Right. They were an alliance of right-wing groups, but their focus was the opposition of big government. Big government is the idea that the government steps in and takes over everyday things, basically. Business leaders didn't like this because of regulations and restrictions. Middle-class voters didn't like this because, one of the reasons was taxes. Disaffected Democrats basically thought there was too much government control, and they wanted the government to move a little bit more moderate. And then you had Christian groups. So we're going to see a theme here, especially coming up in the next one with the Moral Majority, is that Christianity is going to begin to play a role, and you're going to have a movement of people of faith that are going to push for a more conservative agenda. So the Moral Majority was an alliance of religious groups active in the 70s and 80s, and they did not like the liberal attitudes, the behavior, and one thing that they did that was pretty proactive was they raised money for conservative candidates, and the main thing that they wanted is the traditional family values. One thing that we talked about on the last slide was affirmative action. You had the New Right. They were opposing this, and affirmative action is something that requires employers, schools, colleges to give special considerations to women, African Americans, and other minority groups regardless of their qualifications. So the idea was this: you have 100 employees, 15 of them are going to have to be somebody of a minority. So what that means is if you have a white person and you have a person of minority and the business already has 85 white people, even if that white person is more qualified, they're not going to get the job because of affirmative action. There was actually a Supreme Court case. You have the link in your notes where a guy, I think his name was Alan Bakke, he applied for medical school 2 times at the University of California and did not get in. So what we get from affirmative action is the idea that businesses, schools, colleges, they can use race as a factor, but they cannot use it as the only factor to determine someone getting employed there, going to school there, something like that. And that was from the Bakke v. Regents of University of California Supreme Court case. And one of the things that the white people were claiming was that this was reverse discrimination. So they kind of won, but kind of didn't win. What we have now is something called equal opportunity. Moving right along here, the conservative movement. These are the things that led to the rise of the conservative movement. Some of the things that we have been discussing. Go ahead. All right, sorry, I had a teacher come in just then. So we're concluding the rise of the conservative movement. And again, we just talked about all those things that happen in the government, whether it be in the Supreme Court or things that just the direction the country was going. People wanted conservatism. They wanted the right to rise up. So what we have is desegregation of public schools, Roe v. Wade, entitlement programs, the ERA, prayer in schools, evolution being taught in schools rather than creationism. People didn't like that, and they wanted the right to rise up. And the goals of the conservative movement are over here on the right. They wanted to shrink the size of the federal government and reduce spending. They wanted to promote family values and patriotic ideals. What that means is they wanted to get back to traditional Christianity in a way. And then stimulate business by reducing government regulations and lowering taxes. We'll talk more about that when we get into Reaganomics. And then they wanted to strengthen the national defense. So what we get into is the election of 1980. So who you have is you have Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale running for re-election as the Democrats. The Republican ticket is Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. There were a few other people involved running, trying to get the nominee for the Republican Party, but Reagan wins the nomination. Bush was one of those guys that was running with, or trying to get the nomination, but Bush gets named the VP candidate here. So Reagan was actually a New Deal Democrat going back into the 30s, but he thought that many of the Democrats had gone too far left, and so he's trying to bring them back to the middle a little bit. He was actually an actor and the president of the Screen Actors Guild. That means he likes unions, those types of things. Now, in the last chapter, one of the things that we looked at when we talked about the Cold War was in 1979. Again, this is the year before the election. In 1979 was the Islamic Revolution in Iran, and people did not like the way that Carter ran that and how Carter wasn't able to get our people out of the Iran hostage crisis. So that is one thing that led to Reagan actually winning. So here are some of those issues leading up to 1980 election. Abortion, pornography, evolution, prayer in schools, the Iran hostage crisis, the high rate of inflation, increase in national defense. Those were some of the major issues going into the 1980 election. So we talked about the first five. Increase in national defense. So what just happened in 1979 also was that the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. This was supposed to be after détente. Remember, détente was the lessening of Cold War tensions that we had after the Vietnam War into the 70s, where the United States and the Soviet Union were actually supposed to be lessening tensions. They were supposed to be being more friendly. And the Soviets go and invade Afghanistan because, remember, we talked about the Mujahideen who had tried to overthrow the communist regime that was in power there. And so the Soviets, by attacking, weren't really lessening Cold War tensions. So we wanted to make sure we had a good national defense. We also talked about the SDI, the Strategic Defense Initiative, in 1983 that Reagan ended up, it was nicknamed Star Wars, that Reagan ended up passing. And then you get into high rate of inflation. So what was happening in the United States was inflation was going up. Inflation happens naturally, but there are some things that cause inflation to increase. So what inflation is, if you think to your parents or even your grandparents, and sometimes they'll be like, well, I remember when I was a kid, a pop was a nickel, or a soda pop or whatever, or a candy bar was a nickel. And now it's, $1 something or $2. Well, inflation is just the natural rise in prices. Well, there are some things that happen in society that cause inflation to happen more rapidly. And when inflation happens rapidly, there's some negative things that happen. We'll talk about that in a little bit. All right. Reagan ends up winning. He is considered the great communicator because he just clearly answered questions. All right. He would just clearly answer questions. And as you can see here, many of the states are red. Ohio, make sure you take note that Ohio has 25 electors. We're going to work our way up to the 2020 election and see how many electors we have there, so that you're able to look at some cause and effect and what that means and all that stuff. So he wins 500 and there's a total of 538 electoral votes. You have to win 270 to win the election. He won 489, leaving what is that, 49 or something like that. Yeah, I think 49 for Mondale. I don't see it on there. Yeah, there it is. It's 49. It's up here at the top. That's my bad. All right, so Reagan wins 49. Mondale wins 49. This is one of the most lopsided that we've had in a long time. Now, one of the things you're going to know is presidents, what they say, what's important, those types of things. This is what Reagan said that a lot of people think got him elected. In a debate a little bit before the election, he basically finished the debate by asking the public, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? So, here you go. I don't know if you're picking up any of that. I may not have it on to pick up that, but you guys can watch that and listen to it. You got access to my notes on my website and all that. So it's pretty interesting. It's real short. It's only a minute, so take a minute and watch that. So this is where we're at. The U.S. public has been upset with the direction of the country. They dislike the decisions of the Supreme Court that's led by liberals. The public wants to renew traditional Christian values in society while decreasing taxes and big government. To move the country to the right or more conservative, the country overwhelmingly elected Ronald Reagan over Jimmy Carter. So you should be able to understand the direction and changes that will happen in the 1980s. Heads up, we're going to turn conservative. All right. Side note here, Reagan, just over 2 months into his first presidency, has an assassination attempt, and it has nothing to do with Reagan and his viewpoints or anything like that. Here's the assassin right here. His name is John Hinckley Jr., and he did this to win the heart of Jodie Foster. 4 people end up getting shot. If you watch the video on the next couple of slides, you'll see. So I said he wanted to win the heart of Jodie Foster. He got that idea from this movie called Taxi Driver. This guy here has the same ambition in the movie, and John Hinckley Jr., who has been found to be criminally insane, wanted to win the heart of a young Jodie Foster. Great actress, been in a ton of great movies, so has Robert De Niro. So that's what happened. He's out and about right now, and Reagan got shot. Actually, a bullet ricocheted off a window and hit him in the lung, and then he recovered and was able to win re-election in 1984. All right, so let's get to a more conservative economy. It was called Reaganomics, and we did an activity in class. You guys weren't here. Some of you weren't for it, or you're listening to help you better understand stuff. So what Reaganomics is it's supposed to trickle down. So all of these things actually help the upper class, and then the upper class is then supposed to do things where the benefits trickle down into the lower class of people. The liberals, they're on the exact opposite side. I'll show you what I'm talking about here in a little bit. So Reaganomics cut taxes to put more money into the hands of businesses. So you got business owners and corporations at the top. He's going to do a lot of things that puts more money into the hands of businesses and corporations. That then allows them to either invest their money or hire people for a job. So that's that trickle down part, is they're going to get hired. Those lower class people are going to get hired for jobs. They're going to make more money. That's going to help the economy because people are going to use that money and buy goods, and that's going to stimulate economic growth. Now, he was, and just like many conservatives and Trump currently, they want to invest in the supply side. The supply side, again, that's your corporations and your businesses, where liberals want to invest in the demand side. We'll talk about that in a second. What this was going to do is it was going to promote and create new jobs, encourage capital investment, and it's going to lead to a industrial growth. Now, capital investment is where either businesses or individuals take their money and they put it into a company. Then that company can then use that money to increase their own profits. And again, depending on the corporation, they might buy more machinery, they might hire more people, and then what that is able to do is that is able to make that business more money. If you go back to the Cowles approach when we talked about early on the differences between socialism, capitalism, and communism, capitalism allows for you to grow your money through investment. And that was where you sold one cow and you bought a bull, your herd multiplied. You guys remember we talked about that a long time ago. So that's going to create growth, and that's what investment does. So here what you have on this next slide is the differences between conservatives and liberals. Conservatives are on the supply side, liberals are on the demand side. So let's take a look. If you look right here at job creation is also right here. Everything after that's the same. So these two sides are actually fighting for the same thing. They both want to create jobs, they want higher tax revenues for the government, and they want to use that money to reduce federal budget deficits or pay off our debts. The difference is how we get there and where it starts. Conservatives want to start with the wealthy. Liberals want to start with the working or the middle class. Now, I will note the one thing that's different is this capital investment. That is not over here, because typically when you are giving tax breaks to the working and middle class, they're not investing that money. They're using that money to buy necessities or new types of things that they couldn't normally have. Whereas if you are doing tax breaks to the wealthy then invest that into companies that can then hire people like the working and middle class. So there is a little bit of a difference between what the liberals want and what the conservatives want. Next part of Reaganomics is deregulation. So a Republican president would want to limit government regulations because conservatives don't like big government. They want the government out of social and economic affairs. This was part of what Reagan was campaigning for when he meant a smaller government. Reagan actually said government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. So he wanted a much smaller government. This was supposed to increase competition and as a result, lower prices for consumers. If you were in class, I gave you the example of last year when Wendy's started serving breakfast. What McDonald's did is McDonald's actually offered a free Egg McMuffin or something, sausage biscuit, the first day that Wendy's opened up for breakfast. And the idea there was that McDonald's was going to take some of their competition away by offering a free breakfast sandwich to anybody that came in that morning. Yeah, that's going to hurt their profits a little bit, but if you go to McDonald's for a free sandwich, you're also going to get a hash brown, maybe an orange juice or a coffee or a hot chocolate or something also. So they're going to eventually make money, and they're taking that profit away from their competitor, Wendy's. So deregulation basically means that the government's going to get out. The government sets these rules, sets these restrictions, and so by removing those rules and those restrictions, it's actually going to give those companies more freedoms to make money. So the airlines actually didn't have to make unprofitable routes. Well, that's going to benefit the airline because they don't have to spend as much money to make those routes that aren't making them any money. Does it hurt us? Yeah, it hurts the consumers there a little bit because we can't make those trips. We might have to drive farther. So it hurts us, but it also it helps the airline industry so that maybe once in a while they can do an unprofitable route. They don't have to do it at all times. So by taking those regulations out, it's helping the business, and maybe the business, because it's not spending as much money one place, could actually cause it to have cheaper prices somewhere else instead of having to raise its prices. So in a way, it could benefit everybody there. And then there's the EPA, that is the Environmental Protection Agency. Reagan is known for not helping the environment as much as possible. So he cut the budget of the EPA. He sold lots of land that was public land, like parks and those types of things, to developers. That's going to help the economy because people are going to be building houses. So that's going to help construction. That's going to help the sale of home goods, things like that. Open the continental shelf to oil and gas drilling, encourage timber cutting and national forests, and ease restrictions on coal mining. So again, by doing all of those things, he's actually helping all of those businesses. Yes, it's hurting the environment. It's helping the businesses. So, yeah, it's a catch-22. It's helping and hurting. Some regulations that we have today, we have minimum wage and overtime. So depending on your state, you're going to have different amounts of minimum wage. You're also going to get overtime, and typically overtime is time and a half. So your place where you are employed, if you work overtime, you're going to get paid overtime because that's a regulation. Equal opportunity is something we've talked about before as a result of affirmative action. Unions are regulated, and then there's the FMLA Act, which is interesting because if you look at the ERA, the FMLA Act, Family Medical Leave Act, is a little bit different for men and women, and if the ERA passed, that means they would have the same rights under FMLA. We also have antitrust laws and monopolies. We see that going on right now with Google in the lawsuit that they're in. And then there's some tax codes, things like that. There are also some crazy regulations. So if you have access to this and you click on this, it takes you to a website with like 12 or so crazy regulations. They're pretty interesting. So the outcome of Reaganomics, the Reaganomics had 4 pillars. Reduce federal income and capital gains taxes. That's going to help the businesses. Reduce federal spending. That means we're not going to need as much money, so which means we can decrease taxes. Sorry, that was the bell. We're going to reduce government regulation. We just talked about deregulating. And then they're going to tighten the money supply to reduce inflation. Now, let me talk about that for a second. Tightening the money supply. The way that you do that is you increase interest rates. If you increase interest rates, that means people are less likely to get a loan from the bank and spend money. Currently, right now, interest rates are really low, 2, 3, 4%. Reagan actually increased them as much as 18%. That's a really high amount. That means it's going to be more difficult to pay that money back to the bank. So people aren't going to spend money. They're more likely to save it. What that does is that reduces the amount of money that's in circulation. Those two things combined is going to decrease inflation and slow it down a little bit. All right, so that is the outcome of Reaganomics. The stuff on the left just explains what happened with Reaganomics. 1984 rolls along, and we are going to have a presidential election again. Reagan and Bush are going to be renominated as the Republican candidates. Actually, the 1984 election is very similar to the 2000 election. You have the Republicans running again. You have the former VP from the previous Democratic president, and you have a female running for VP. Now, Geraldine Ferraro was the first female on a major party's ticket, major party being Democrats or Republicans. So you have Biden and Harris, just like very similar, running for the Democrats as it was a long time ago in 1984. Now, Reagan, and you see this list down here. You got businessmen and women. You have Southerners, Westerners, Reagan Democrats. All these people supported Reagan. Interesting thing is Ferraro was the first woman on a major party's ticket. Reagan actually increases his popular vote by about 9.5 to 10%, and then he carried 525 out of 538 electoral college votes. Mondale won Minnesota and the District of Columbia. Sorry, another interruption. So this is what it looked like. You got Minnesota and D.C. were the only two areas that Mondale won. Reagan won everything else. So 525 to 13 there. In the last term that Reagan served, there were some Supreme Court openings. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the Supreme Court. Interesting, the day I'm making this video is the day that Amy Coney Barrett, just the day after Amy Coney Barrett got confirmed into the Supreme Court. So what we have is we have Sandra Day O'Connor. She's going to be the first female justice. So she's going to go in as an associate justice. She gets confirmed 99-0. Now remember, the liberals were running the court up to this point. All right, so it was 6-3 liberals. No, I'm sorry, 7-2. So with O'Connor going in, it's now 6-3. Somebody else, another liberal leaves. Rehnquist is already on the court. He's going to get elevated. That means he is already an associate justice. He's going to get elevated as the chief justice. All right, so now we're going to have a conservative Chief Justice, and then he gets confirmed as Chief Justice 6533, and then Scalia is going to get brought in to make it 5-4. So now it's going to be 5-4. Scalia gets voted in 98-0. And so now it's 5-4 liberals. It's still 5-4 liberals. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky, is what happens next. So Reagan nominates a guy by the name of Robert Bork. Bork is not the most popular guy. He's actually really far right. Reagan, a lot of people say, did not make a good choice here. It's leaned to the left. So now what's going to happen is he chooses Bork to go in as what would be the 5-4 in the advantage of the conservatives for the first time since like the 30s. And it's Bork's really far right. He didn't make a good choice here, is what a lot of people say. So if you watch this video, this is the Supreme Court this is the Supreme Court hearings where the Senate Judiciary Committee will actually interview and ask questions, and they do this for a few days. This just happened a few weeks ago with Amy Coney Barrett. And actually, interesting, the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee was one Joe Biden in the late 80s. Bork was not a big fan of privacy. Actually, a reporter went to Potomac Video in 87 and got his history of videos that he had watched and put it out there just to kind of let him know that privacy was important. That ended up going to the courts, and it became the Video Privacy Protection Act of 1988. It has some connections to later on with Netflix and putting stuff out there and how it was private and they weren't allowed to do that. So pretty interesting. All right, here you see Joe Biden. Joe Biden, again, was the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Bork does not get nominated. Bork does not go through, so that means Reagan has to nominate somebody else. This guy was on his radar. This guy was on Reagan's radar. His name is Douglas H. Ginsburg. Ginsburg withdrew his name after he was coming under fire for smoking marijuana while he was a professor at Harvard Law. So Reagan settles with a guy by the name of Anthony Kennedy. Kennedy was nominated by Reagan on and he gets voted in 97-0. So Kennedy gets in there. So now the conservatives control the Supreme Court. Now Reagan's scandal is the Iran-Contra affair. You're going to want to watch this video. It's going to do rundowns of what happened. So basically, we've talked about both of these things. You have what's going on in Iran, and you have what's going on in Nicaragua. In Iran, they're actually fighting a war against Iraq. They actually have kidnapped more Americans. It's only 6 or 7 at this point, and we want them home. And then in Nicaragua, you have a civil war between the Contras and the Sandinistas. The Cold War is still going on. This is the 80s. The Contras are non-communist, and the Sandinistas are communist, so the United States leans toward supporting the Contras. The problem with the Contras is that they get all their money and all their funds through the cocaine trade, so we actually make an amendment called the Bolin Agreement, that we are not allowed to give money to the Contras or anybody in Nicaragua. So the Iran-Contra affair is basically where we say we're going to give $30 million to Iran, but we funnel like 18 of that 30 million to the Contras to defeat the Sandinistas. So Reagan doesn't really get into trouble for this, and the public doesn't really care because his approval rating doesn't drop all that much. The next topic are some issues going on in the 1980s. You have AIDS, abortion, drug abuse, education, and an urban crisis. And then you have inequalities of women and inequalities of minorities. All right, so here is society's response. Here's the government's response. So basically, with AIDS, that's being a disease that can be transmitted a lot of different ways. But basically, the government said, all right, let's just do sex education. There were pro-life and abortion. We have opponents they're pro-life, proponents are pro-choice. Basically, what we get as a result of this is Webster v. Reproductive Healthcare Services that ruled that states had the right to impose restrictions on abortion. So depending on your state, whether it's conservative or liberal, you may have something different about abortion. Drugs became a huge thing. Reagan actually put a war out on drugs, and he tried to, his wife actually led it. It was the Just Say No campaign, and he basically used it as a deterrent. He wanted everybody to go to jail if they were caught using, selling, anything like that. So drug dealers, drug users got really harsh punishments for doing or dealing drugs. Education, the push was for prayer to return to school, evolution not be taught in schools, or creationism to at least be taught alongside it. And also there were some people calling for us to have more homework, longer school days, and an extended school year because our nation was at risk. The urban crisis was white flight that we've talked about, white people leaving the inner cities, leaving minorities and poor people, the people that couldn't afford to leave and go to the suburbs, in the middle of the cities. We've talked about this before. And then there's inequalities. By 1989, 20 states adopted pay equity laws. It's still not where it needs to be today. Ferraro was one of the people that was pushing for this to close the pay gap. And then we got minorities. A lot of people think that African Americans are the only minorities, but we also have Latinos, we have Native Americans, we have lots of different types of groups, women that are considered to be minorities. We get a lot of funding and new programs and things that actually were cut by the conservatives. So those programs were there, placed by the liberals in the 60s and 70s. The Voting Rights Act actually comes about. That allowed Latinos to vote in their native language, so that they had tests done in Spanish. And then some other things happened where conservatives were cutting funding and programs for some of the minorities. Jesse Jackson was one of the prominent people there. You'll see him in the video for the 88 election as one of the people running for that. All right, in the 88 presidential election, Reagan can't run. He's already served 2 terms. He's not allowed to per the 22nd Amendment. So you got George Herman Walker Bush and Dan Quayle running for president. Dan Quayle's running for vice president. Bush is running for president against Michael Dukakis and Lloyd Bentsen. There were a lot of Democrats who wanted to run in this as well. Bush is going to win. Bush wins 426 to Dukakis' 111 votes. The problem with Bush winning is the Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives was controlled by the Democrats. So Bush said, read my lips, no new taxes. So just like Reagan had his thing, are you better off than you were 4 years ago, Bush had his thing, read my lips, no new taxes. The problem was this. When Bush was elected president, he actually signed a bill to add new taxes. So one thing that happens in the late 1900s and in the 1980s is that Americans are beginning to move. So what we see the Rust Belt here. The reason it's called the Rust Belt is many of the factories that are there are rusting. The jobs have left, and they're actually moving into the southeast, south, and southwest. All right, and so the factories are going there for a few reasons. One, they get tax breaks, so they have favorable economic policies. There's affordable and abundant housing options for the people. So housing down there in the 1980s is pretty much the way that it is up in the region I'm at in Mansfield. Is it's pretty cheaper here now, but back then it was actually cheaper to go south and buy a house. And then finally it was the unions. So the North had a lot of unions. They went on strike in the 60s and 70s, even into the 80s, and the business owners didn't want to put up with unions. So some of the regulations that the government had taken away when Reagan was president is dealing with unions, and the fact that in the South, they didn't have unions as much. And so if you're a business owner, yeah, that was enticing to not have people asking for more money and better working conditions. That meant more money for you and in your pocket. So here what you see is the Northeast and the Midwest, you see a lot of people leaving to go to the West and then into the South as well. Finally, last slide here, more issues during the 1980s. You had the farm crisis. A lot of farms went out of business. People lost their homes to being foreclosed. We talked about that manufacturing shift. Some of the ones that didn't go south, they actually went overseas due to labor costs, because here in the United States, we talked about minimum wage. In other countries, you can pay people a heck of a lot less to work at your company than you can here in the United States, which means more money in your pocket as a business owner. And one of the major events in the 80s was the Space Shuttle Challenger exploding shortly after takeoff. There was a problem. The night before, the temperature got really low. One of the O-rings had a malfunction, and yeah, the space shuttle exploded. There were some classrooms around the world that actually had this on live, and the teachers didn't really know how to react to that. So that is the 1980s. We are going to get into the 1990s in the next video. If you guys have questions, please make sure to let me know. Thank you. Bye-bye.